Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started. Welcome to today's Grand Round panel discussion on the past, present, and future, Rochester's journey towards an equitable future. Today's Grand Round is a hybrid meeting with participants on Zoom for those not able to attend this live event. Today's Grand Round also is scheduled for CME credits. If you signed up for the event, you'll get an email that will tell you exactly how to get CME credit. If you have not done so, at the end of this meeting, there'll be a link whereby you can opt to get CME credits at that time. We have as you can see, a full panel, and so we're going to have a lot of discussion today. So let me introduce to you our panelists today. I'm going to do a very brief introduction because to go through all their accomplishments and accolades would take the whole hour. So with no further ado, I'm going to present to you Melanie Funchess. Melanie Funchess is CEO and principal of Ubuntu Village Works. She is dedicated her whole life really to responsive, community-driven healing and wellness spaces. And she's a great friend and a great collaborator. Next to her is Mr. Dana Miller, who is Deputy Commissioner of Neighborhood Business Development at the City of Rochester, and also a graduate of the Simon School of Business. Next to Mr. Miller is Dr. Mike Rotondo, who is CEO of UR Medical Faculty Group and Senior VP of the Office of Health Sciences, as well as our lead in the health equity movement at URMC. And finally, on my right is Simeon Banister, who is President and CEO of the Rochester Area Community Foundation. So this Grand Rounds Week presentation on the memory and celebration of Martin Luther King's life, it's sponsored by the Department of Psychiatry and the Department of Neurology. We have decided that this year we would dedicate this week's events to the memory of Reverend Dr. John S. Walker. He was an adjunct professor of psychiatry, a wonderful teacher, scholar, friend, and colleague who passed away 2 weeks ago. He reveled in planning for this event every year. And so it is with a great deal of respect for what he taught us that we present to you this panel. He would have loved this panel. So last night, I was remembering and reading into Dr. Martin Luther King's speeches and writings, and I came upon his very last speech, the one that he gave in Memphis, Tennessee, the night before he was assassinated. It's a really impressive and passionate speech, and if some of you have not heard it, I invite you to listen to it or read it online. In my opinion, it's his best speech. It's titled, "I've Been to the Mountaintop." And it's a jarring speech in retrospect, as he was assassinated the day after. However, during the speech, he kind of takes inventory of all the things he has done and those things he has yet to do. And so I think it is in that frame that I hope to begin to have this discussion today. We know that there are also in that speech, I think that Dr. King pivots from the idea that equity is going to come through the voting rights and realizes that there needs to be a pivot towards economic empowerment. And I think that that is a very powerful speech and a very powerful idea that still needs to transcend, and we need to keep it in mind. Most of us live in the city, love the city. It's a beautiful city. We all feel safe in this city, at least some of us do. But we all know that it's a tale of two cities. There are incredible disparities, and yet it is still until a child is born in the center of the city, has the same opportunity as one born in Pittsburgh, Webster, or Brighton, we still have a lot of work to do as a group and not only as a medical center, but as a city and as just residents of the city. And so we seek answers today, and we seek to find solutions in order to find our way towards an equitable future. With that in mind, I'm going to ask each one of our panelists the following question. I know each of you have a different perspective because of your own individual ideas and your roles. And so I think it will be enriching to have each of you answer this question. How can we, the URMC community, in collaboration with city leaders such as yourselves, pave the way towards a more equitable Rochester? What is happening now to meet this goal, and what needs to still happen? Can we start with you, Simeon?
Number one, let me just thank Telva and everyone that has joined today for what I know is going to be a fascinating and robust conversation. I was also reflecting on some of Dr. King's work. And one of the things that very famous piece of writing is the letter from the Birmingham jail. And in that particular letter, he describes this idea that we are part of a network of mutuality tied up in a single garment of destiny. And it strikes me that that is a lesson that we have not learned sufficiently in this community. That what happens in the city of Rochester has everything to do with what happens in Webster and Brighton and Pittsburgh and vice versa. And the interconnective tissue that binds us together is where we really need to focus. I would encourage folks in this room, a lot of times we think of issues related to social justice and racial equity. I'll make an argument perhaps a little bit later for why we really need to focus in those areas. But assuming that you agree with me, a lot of times we think of that work as an avocation. It's something that we do outside of our day-to-day job. It's the side work, but our real work is, whether it's in the healthcare professions and other places. I want to disabuse you of that notion. What we would love for you to do is, as you are performing medicine, do that with equity and justice in mind. As you are engaging with patients, do that with equity and justice in mind, because your vocation is equally important as your avocation.
Well, I too would like to welcome all of you, and Dr. Olivares, thank you for the opportunity to sit amongst these esteemed colleagues. I must tell you, I'm humbled to be with these dedicated community leaders for all they bring to Rochester. The question you've asked is an extremely broad one. And when I think about all the resources that a university can bring to a community, and I think about all of the responsibilities that a medical center has in a community, the list of things that are happening now are daunting to recount, but they pale in comparison by what we must do in the future. There's no question about it that academic medical centers have evolved over the last, really since the 1960s to where we are today, moving through a period of the civil rights movement in the 1960s with Lyndon Johnson proclaiming the Great Society and putting Medicare and Medicaid in place. And the moment that those two tools were put in place for America, 25% of the Medicaid patients were already did not have adequate funding or access to care. The moment it was signed into law. The systems that we have in place, quite frankly, have never been adequate to support our population. And we have responded in a way as a country with far less than adequate answers that we have needed all along. The academic medical centers that evolved going into, if you look at the public hospital system from which they came, many of them came, again, was about establishing so-called safety net hospitals. But what I've come to realize is that if all we do is catch patients, the moment they fall into the net, it is far too late. We've not met our responsibility on the one hand, either to deliver care, but more importantly, to assure care, to assure health, not just deliver health care, but assure health. That's an important distinction. So the responsibilities then of the medical center within the university even go broader than that by virtue of what universities can bring in terms of creative thought, in terms of its responsibility to strengthen the fabric of the society. There is much more that we can do moving forward. And I hope we can get into some of those details as we move forward.
Thank you. Mr. Miller.
Thank you for your time and your attention today. This is it's a great opportunity to talk to a great group of folks that are going to be making a huge difference as we go forward. When we talk about inequality, very often it is prefaced by the word income inequality. So I just want to talk about that for a minute. You know, the speech that was referenced before that Martin Luther King gave, he said very clearly in that very same speech, I may not get there with you, as if to preface his own knowledge that his life was in danger. But unfortunately, very many of us have not gotten there yet. And that is a challenge. When we look at health in particular, for example, according to Health Affairs, income is strongly associated with morbidity and mortality across the income distribution, and income-related health disparities are growing over time. And poor health contributes to reduced income, which creates a negative feedback loop, sometimes referred to as the health poverty trap. So we are challenged with the fact that right now, as we sit here, 48.2% of all children in the city of Rochester live in poverty. They all are living in poverty, almost half of the children in the city of Rochester. And Americans living in families that earn less than $35,000 a year are 4 times as likely to be nervous or sad most of the time. And so, you know, the question is, what do we do about these disparities? And so, you know, in the 40s and 50s and 60s, if you were to say to somebody, boy, what's happening in Rochester? How are people earning their living? The answer would have been Eastman Kodak, Xerox, Bausch and Lomb, and the 2 different General Motors plants. Those were jobs that paid people living wages, that allowed people to buy houses, raise their families, and be, you know, somewhat successful. And we didn't see this level of poverty. Those businesses are all essentially gone at this point, along with a number of others like French's and Ragu and all of the others. So right now, you're sitting right here in part of what is the largest employer in Rochester. The University of Rochester, according to its website, employs more than 33,000 people. That's a lot of people. But how can we ensure that those people have the opportunity to work full-time versus part-time? How can we ensure that those people who do work full-time are able to make a wage that takes them out of poverty? And that doesn't sound like a lot, but it's $13. If they make $13 an hour or more full-time, that will take them out of poverty. If they're working half-time, part-time, they're in poverty, even if they're making $13 an hour. So that's one challenge for us. And the other challenge is right now, I mean, I went to the U of R's website yesterday just to see, and there are 3,000 job openings right now. How do we fill those 3,000 job openings? I mean, I realize that there's a range of skills. And as I looked through some of those, I said, no, can't do that. Nope, I can't do that. I have an MBA, but I can't do that. So, you know, there are some jobs that need different skills, but there were some jobs that were, you know, pretty basic. And the other thing I just want to leave you with in this part is, you know, we talk about poverty and we talk about families, and the federal government and the state government and our local government look at poverty based on a family of 4. But a family of four is very different if it's two parents and two children, or if it's one parent and three children. And the family that has one parent and three children is unfortunately very pervasive in our city. And that is why 48% of the children are living in poverty, because they have one parent who is struggling with childcare, who is struggling with housing, struggling with making $13 an hour part-time because they can't get full-time work, because if you get full-time work, then you have to get benefits. So then they don't have benefits. So then when the child gets sick, what do? So we had a very, very traumatic and tragic situation where a mom made that exact decision. She had to go to work. She took her 3-year-old to work with her. The 3-year-old managed to unfortunately fall in the grease trap and die. This is the kind of thing that happens when we don't have the right kind of situations for families in this city and in every city.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'd first like to give honor to Reverend John Walker, to our recent ancestor, and just thank you for this opportunity. When I think about what have we done and what can we do, the name of my business is Ubuntu Village Works. Ubuntu translates into I am because we are. It talks about interconnectedness like Simeon just spoke about. And one of the things that we have not done, like he said, is that we don't see each other. And when we're speaking about equity and about how to move to a more equitable society, if we can't see each other and we cannot see the humanity of one another, we can't go anywhere. That translates everywhere from the way that people get portrayed in media to down into the doctor's office. And I'm going to offer, and just so people know, I don't just work for Hair Club, I'm also a client, right? I speak from lived experience. My husband was diagnosed here with cancer and given 2 weeks to live 22 years ago. He's still alive, right? Yay, right? But what we found out, he's right now battling a recurrence. He's in fact, he had radiation this morning before I got here. What we found out a few weeks ago was that when he had his recurrence in 2006, if he had been offered radiation then, we wouldn't be here today. Because the radiation more likely would have taken out the cancer at the place, because he's having a recurrence in the same place that they're giving him radiation in now. So then I asked, was radiation an option in 2006? And they said, yes. Was it safe? Yes. Was it effective? Did it have FDA approval? Yes, yes, yes. So why was it not offered to us? When my husband was first diagnosed, I had 3 stair-step babies. My babies were 5, 3, and 1, and I was pregnant with my 4th. All I asked was my husband to live to see all of my children graduate college, get married, real things like walk them down the aisle. But because of my husband being a Black man, they did not see him 22 years ago and he almost died because they thought he had HIV. 22 years later, even though we know that my husband can do 20 rounds of radiation and get cancer-free, potentially, was according to what the data says, he was still offered a year of Rituxan. And I had to advocate. Until the University of Rochester is able to see me and see not just me, but the people who work for you as human beings who live in these communities, and see us as whole and total, and see that everything that I do is equally ties into what you do. You cannot be well if I am sick. That's what Ubuntu means. You cannot be well if I am sick. You cannot be prosperous if I am destitute. And until we see one another like that, we're doing nothing.
True, Melanie.
That's why you invited
True,
me.
Melanie speaking there. Thank you, Melanie. I mean, you say some of the things that really need to be said in some of these spaces, especially in this space where a lot of us grew up very privileged to be seen and not have to worry about being seen. So thank you very much for that perspective. I'm going to ask a question that I've had. In June of 2020, the mayor of the city and the county executive joined forces to create the Commission for Racial and Structural Equity, or RACE. It was meant to examine and develop policies to deal with the structural and institutional racism in our city and our county. Groups were formed, I know people met, and over a year ago, recommendations came out. I'm wondering, and I'm sure some of you are wondering in the audience, what has happened to those recommendations? What are we doing? Has anything been done thus far with any of those recommendations? And if not, what do we as a community need to do to help nudge along progress? Simeon?
Sure. So as I suspected might happen for this panel, there have just been some really tasty morsels that have been offered for us to chew on. So I'll see if we can't weave some of those together in answering this question. But before, can I just do a quick heat check? How many folks here are familiar with the book by Richard Rothstein, Color of Law? Raise your hand. Just, all right. And then one more level set. How many folks are familiar with the text, The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee? So we have some folks in the room. So before we even get started, those that have not become familiarized with those texts, I want to strongly encourage you to read those texts, The Color of Law and The Sum of Us. When you read The Sum of Us, because I know you're busy, you got a lot on your plate, you got a lot going on. If you read The Sum of Us, I really want you to focus on chapter 10, which speaks about this concept called the solidarity dividend. And what Heather McGhee, who was actually with us at the Community Foundation last night, had the good fortune to introduce her in a session that we did to learn a little bit more as a community about this solidarity dividend. She argues that what we have seen as a result of this idea of zero-sum economic conditions, that for some people to win, other people have to lose. That is often the presumption that we have, that zero-sum economic model undermines our ability to appreciate our interconnectedness, that network of mutuality. The consequence there for us is that we have seen a massive contraction of the public good. Now, I have the great fortune of working for an organization that is responsible for transferring assets from private interests back into the public good, back into the public domain. She gives a very, very powerful story of what she described as the public pool problem. And the public pool problem was that as soon as pools all across the country decided to integrate, many communities would rather drain those pools, these huge public investments, than share them because of this perception of a zero-sum economic model. And in many ways, that is the milieu, the cultural milieu in which many of us have been raised and many of us are steeped. And so when we have ideas and opportunities that come forward, like the RACE Commission, one of the challenges, and that was a great body of work with wonderful recommendations, but one of the challenges is overcoming the problem of will. Dr. King said that we have the resources and the techniques to solve poverty. There's nothing new about poverty, but he begged the question, do we have the will? And all too often, we have been sold a bad bill of goods that suggests that in order for some people to succeed, other people have to fail. And that is not true. Last thing I'd say on this, child poverty across this country, a lot of people don't know this, declined by 60% over the last 30 years. There was an article in the New York Times about this last year. 60% decline in childhood poverty. And that did not happen here in Rochester. And that's in part because many of those declines happened for two reasons. In the late 90s and the 2010s, and as Dana alluded to, what was happening in Rochester in the late 90s, for those history buffs out there, Rochester, Xerox, and Kodak were deteriorating. Our economy was fundamentally changing. The other thing that happened was that in many cases, policy decisions, they noted in this article in the underlying research, that accessibility to this public good, to these resources, is what drove the decline in poverty. That access to SNAP benefits, amongst other things, were the key driver. In Rochester, when money would come, because the county is the primary vehicle where those resources get distributed, in those days when money would come, they would reduce the budget, backfill it with the money that was coming, and the summative benefit of those monies would not reach the intended audience, so that we could keep lower taxes. That's the cost for not seeing the interconnective tissue. And we have a lot of politicians and others who sell us this zero-sum game, and it is not accurate. That in fact, we could actually reduce our overall costs by making sure that those benefits arrive what they were intended to. So there is a interconnective tissue here. And what I'm looking for from all of you is to find your way into the kind of advocacy that reveals it and drives us towards change.
Yeah. And the Race Commission had, 5 specific recommendations that they came up with, not the least of which was to, create and invest and sustain in the very communities that we're talking about, Black and Latinx in particular. I just want to add a little bit of perspective. I'm in many ways a son of the community and a son of the University of Rochester. My grandparents, when they came over from Italy in the early 1900s, bought a house at 192 Bay Street on the corner of Bay and Roar Street, which is the house that my father was actually born in the house. English was his second language. And I have absolutely vivid memories of being a 6-7-year-old of what was happening in 1963 and 1964, just a few blocks to the west when the riots occurred.
Uprising.
The uprising occurred. Thank you, ma'am. And and my father, who was an only child and went to Aquinas Institute, was pretty fancy stuff back then. His mother and father, my grandparents, could afford that. Went to work for Eastman Kodak Company, of course, as a bottle washer, a tech. I think we would call him a lab tech in the old Ectochrome lab. And then he came to the University of Rochester for 9 years for night school to get his chemistry degree. So I literally grew up in many ways in the shadow of Eastman Kodak Company and the shadow of this university, and benefited from Eastman Kodak Company, who in 1965 had about $1 billion in sales and about a 10% profit. They made about $100 million in 1965. In 1995, just before the decline that Mr. Banister has just described, they had $15 billion in sales and a profit of $1.5 billion, about 10% again. This university right now, this medical center, I should say, this medical center has roughly about $4.8 billion in revenues. This year we will break even if we're lucky. So even though we now have 2 of the largest employers, it's our health system and our university, and it's the other system, look how the economics have changed. They've changed dramatically. Now that sounds like an excuse, and I don't mean it to. It is the reality of the dollars that we have when we are all acutely aware of the relationship that Dana pointed out at the outset of this, that the relationship between poverty and health is inextricable. Absolutely inextricable. So what is our fundamental responsibility? I'll go back to healthcare delivery versus assuring health. If we believe that to assure health, we as a university have to contribute, that if we indeed believe that the relationship between poverty and health is inextricably, then what should we do as a health system and a university? We have to work on economic development. We have to be focused on that in a way that's a lot more creative than just trying to find money on the bottom line to give to somebody. It goes back to the interdependencies. Our relationships have to fundamentally change. And in order for us to have credibility in that process, we have to not only devise specific programs for today and tomorrow, we also have to own our inheritance, all of which we know is not positive as a university. I experienced that too growing up with this university at a different time. That's the only way I think we're going to be able to convince the community that we really are seeing them. And then we have to take very specific actions, and what's happened since the cataclysmic events of the spring of 2020 is we have taken some very, very pointed actions in our equity and anti-racism plan under Dr. Adrian Morgan's leadership here at the university to begin to shift our culture. And culture is about behaviors, which means that we've got to be absolutely clear about what constitutes acceptable behaviors, on the one hand with each other, on the other hand with our patients, so we can begin to rebuild that trust in the community. And that is a long journey. That can't happen overnight, but it has to happen. And so remember, if our culture, if we have an equitable and just culture, and how do you define that? It is by how people interface with each other on a daily basis. It's what they do and don't do. And at the end of that, the only true measure, outcome measure, is however the other person has felt as a result of it. How did it make them feel? And so we now are really, I think, are incredibly committed to that. And on the one hand, that's about our culture here. On the other hand, it's the policies that we have in place about how we interface with the economic resources in the community. Are we really investing in local vendors and local businesses? Are we preferentially and with intentionality taking the resources that we do put into the community? Frankly, we put hundreds of millions of dollars into the community by virtue of the research enterprise that we have. We do those things, but we need to make sure that we look creatively at all the tools that we have and leverage them in a way that partners with the community effectively to drive economic development here in Rochester, New York.
I just want to pick up on something that Dr. Rotondo said, because I think, sometimes we talk about these issues in ways that feel maybe a bit esoteric. And so I really want to kind of drive the point home, particularly with respect to this kind of story about Kodak, right? And so Kodak, this industry that had grown particularly in the earlier part of the 20th century. And what was happening in the United States, as we all recall, in the early part of the 20th century, is that a lot of folks that had been white ethnic immigrants to this country, Ireland, Italy, et cetera, who had been despised largely, right? Had been degraded in degraded conditions. What now Irvin Painter in her book, The History of White People, calls the expansion of whiteness, are grafted into Americanness, right? Different people show up, and guess what happens? There's this explosion of energy and economic growth. I want to read just one quick excerpt from Heather McGee's work. Quoting Catherine Phillips, who was a professor at the Columbia Business School. She says, members of a homogeneous group rest somewhat assured that they will agree with one another, that they will understand one another's perspectives and beliefs, that they will be able to easily come to consensus. But when members of a group notice that they are socially different from one another, they change their expectations. They anticipate differences of opinion and perspective. They assume that they will need to work harder to come to consensus. This logic helps explain both the upside and the downside of social diversity. People work harder in diverse environments, both cognitively and socially. They might not like it, but the hard work leads to better outcomes. Fast forward in this Kodak story to boardrooms that look like homogeneity, to self-reinforcing, backslapping, maybe even a little complacent boardrooms that miss things like the digital revolution. A contributing factor to our economic decline is the lack of diversity. And so the thing that we can do different is to embrace different perspectives, to do the work to create economic growth.
And wait, I want to, because I can't let this slide, is the fact that, this with the Kodak story, right? Again, the tale of two Rochesters, that story was willfully made homogeneous. My mother, when she emigrated, both people know I'm adopted. My mother here, when she emigrated from Florida, she couldn't get a job at Kodak. Kodak couldn't have been her reality. She may have been able to clean the house of someone who worked at Kodak, but so she did not have access to that living wage job. A lot of people who we knew did not have access to products, to Kodak, to Bausch and Lomb, to Xerox, to all of those places until Fight.
Right.
So when we tell this generational story, we've got to tell the whole thing, right? What is the situation about how people came into the University of Rochester? How many of us did they let in at one time? What was the situation for us? You know, even up until a few years ago when they had the yik yak and the kids at the Douglas Leadership House couldn't live in peace. So when we're telling a whole story of how we got here and what we're doing, make sure we tell this story in its entirety, because this is a created situation. In terms of the race commission, I know I'm going out of turn, but in terms of the race commission, while I'm talking,
That's okay.
there's two different types of challenges in our world. There are technical challenges that are fixed by policies and forms and things, but there's also adaptive challenges that need changes of thought, attitudes, and behaviors. What the race commission did was they talked about the technical solutions that needed to be made, but they did not take enough time to look at the adaptive things, the thoughts of the changes of thoughts, attitudes, and behaviors, that the will that Simeon is talking about that needs to happen among our populace to make these other things live. If the boards are still going to look homogeneous and have these same thoughts and miss vital things because they're not diverse, if we are not going to see, because I choose to wear mud cloth and natural hair and large earrings and dark lipstick, you're not going to see that my value is equitable to blonde hair, no shade of blondes, right? But blonde hair, blue-eyed, traditional standard of beauty, until we get to the underlying implicit and explicit manifestations of that. We're not going anywhere, and the Race Commission's report is just another sheet of paper.
So I guess it's my turn. I just want to talk for a minute about, why do we even need a race commission? And Melanie touched on something just a moment ago that just made me think, because, back in the late 1960s and most of the 1970s, we keep talking about Kodak because Kodak was just so pervasive in Rochester's history and society. But the guy, and he had to be a guy at that time, who was president of Eastman Kodak Company, was a guy named Gerald Zorno. And Gerald Zorno was a very nice guy. I believe he graduated from the University of Rochester as well. But my wife's mother cleaned his house. So that was her job. And that was the only job.
And that was her connection to Kodak.
And that was her connection to Kodak, was that she was the house cleaner for Gerald Zorno. And, he was somewhat generous. He gave my wife, when she was a little girl, a movie camera and a movie projector. And she was able to make movies. And we have movies of her and her siblings growing up because she had that camera. But, if her mom could have worked at Kodak, she probably could have bought one instead of having that as a gift. But, why do we need this race commission, the Racial and Structural Equity Commission? Why do we even need that? And part of the challenge is that, our history is not that different in Rochester from the history in other parts of the world. We had a couple of companies here that were really big, but so did Pittsburgh, so did Buffalo, so did Cleveland. We all had, kind of the Detroit. Think of the industry in those places. But, in some places like Detroit, where a strong back could get you a job on an assembly line, lifting motor castings out of a hot furnace, you couldn't get those kinds of jobs at Kodak. It was very difficult. The work was different. The expectation was different. And it was hard to get those jobs. And when we think about Rochester, as recently as 1950, in the 1950 census, Rochester's population was the highest it has ever been, 332,000 people. And of those 332,000 people, 2% of them were Black, just 2%. But during the Great Migration, as more people of color moved out of the South to escape the horrible Jim Crow laws, Rochester's population tripled to more than 25,000 Black people in just a couple of years. And all of those people came here looking for opportunity that was not, unfortunately, available. It was not available. You couldn't work on the assembly line at Kodak in 1950. You couldn't work on the assembly line at Bausch and Lomb in 1950. Xerox didn't even exist yet. So you couldn't work at Xerox. You know, there were very few places you could work other than cleaning people's houses. My mom did ironing for people who would, you know, she would go to their house, pick up their ironing, bring it home, iron it all in our kitchen, and then take it back on hangers. I mean, you know, those were the kinds of jobs that were available to people. And then, you know, we had to deal with this thing that my friend Howard Eagle always talks about: individual, institutional, and structural racism, the three ways that racism exists. And so, you know, that structural and institutional racism was reinforced. And I understand that you guys have seen a trailer about redlining, but the redlining really, of all the possible things that could have done damage to Rochester, redlining did the most damage to Rochester of anything that could have happened. Because when the Homeowners Loan Corporation made those maps in 1950, I know you can't, 1930, 1940, I know you can't see them, but they redlined certain areas of Rochester and said those areas are unsafe, that no loans should be made, that no mortgages should be written, that no banks should be involved in those areas. And what they wrote about at Corn Hill, at that time, Corn Hill was close to 100% Black. And what they wrote about Corn Hill in the report was, 10 years ago, this was a section of beautiful old homes. Some still remain, massive structures and still handsome. However, Negroes have come into the area, and today it is the poorest section of the entire city. The most that can be said for the neighborhood is that it's convenient. And as a result of that, no loans were made. When my parents migrated here from Kentucky in 1956, they couldn't buy a house. They wanted to buy a house, but there were no houses to be sold or no mortgages to be written. They ultimately did find an apartment, and they lived in the apartment for 2 years. And then they were able to find a house, but only because there was a guy who would hold the mortgage for them. And so he held the mortgage. He would come to our house the first Saturday of every month. He would collect the payment, and eventually they were able to buy the house. But it was in that redlined area. And so they bought the house in 1958 for $10,000. Today, the house is worth $10,000. So that's why we need a race commission. Now, just to talk about, I mean, so our role in it in the city, you know, we were part of the sponsors of that. My role as Commissioner of Neighborhood and Business Development is business development, housing inspection, housing compliance, zoning, all of those fun things that we get to do every day. But, you know, we have used the data from the Race Commission to help us assist businesses. We have targeted businesses in areas that were redlined: Hudson Avenue, Jefferson Avenue, Joseph Avenue, North Clinton. We have targeted those areas to provide funding for business startup, for business growth, for business rehab. And we have really focused intently on those areas. And in housing, we started a new program that is called Buy the Block, B-U-Y, Buy the Block. And we have picked areas that are on this map that were redlined, and we are building new houses in those areas. Because in most of those areas, if you go there right now, if you go over to Thomas Street right now, you'll see vacant lots. We have more than 2,200 vacant lots in the city of Rochester right now. Places that used to be houses that people lived in, and those houses were demolished because they just got more and more run down. And like my parents' house, it wasn't worth enough to be able to get a mortgage or a second mortgage or a home equity loan or anything. If you didn't have the cash, you couldn't fix the house up. A few years back, my parents' house needed a new roof. They got an estimate, it was $10,000. I said, Mom, you can't spend $10,000 on a roof for a $10,000 house. And she looked at me and she said, what am I gonna do? It's our home. And they spent the money. But everybody can't do that.
Mhm.
And so that's our challenge.
Wow. This round was full of a lot of nuggets and really stirred my own memories. I'm mindful of the time and I see that there's people up in the audience that want to ask a question. Do you want to ask your question?
So I also grew up in Rochester in the 70s, and I'm wondering how much the change in education system has impacted this. When I was going to school, there were 3 tracks. You had your honors, regents, and local. And the local track also allowed people to go to trade schools. That has since been eliminated. Now everybody has to pass the regents exams, which for some people are not possible. My partner is a heavy-duty truck mechanic. He barely made it through high school, but has a great paying job. Had he not had a local track to go through, he wouldn't have gotten his job. I'm a trauma therapist at Heal. I worked with a patient for years. She tried to go to hairdressing school. She could not pass the Regents exam to allow her to get her GED so that she could go earn enough money to support her and her 3 daughters. And she worked for years trying to take that test. And so it feels like what used to exist back in the 70s when I was in school in the 80s has been eliminated and has actually made it more difficult for people to get good paying jobs because they can't pass these exams. I hold a master's degree. I looked at the exam with my patient. I don't know that I could pass it. And I hold a master's degree. And here we're expecting somebody who had an 8th, 9th grade education to pass the exam and now limit her ability to get work because she can't go to hairdressing school without that GED.
Let me take a crack at it. So I have the good fortune of working at the Community Foundation. And it is both one of the most awesome and best jobs and one of the most vexing jobs that someone can hold. And the reason why it's such a vexing job is that you start a conversation about education and inevitably you say, well, geez, it's really hard for kids to learn when they're hungry. It's really hard for kids to learn when they're enduring trauma at home. That's really tough. So we really got to focus on food security and we've really got to focus on trauma-informed care. But then you're talking to Dana, who says, you know what, man, when you have a 2-parent household, not so much because of the quote traditional values, but because when you have 2 incomes,
Right.
those 2 incomes drive different outcomes, alleviating food security, alleviating even some of the issues around trauma. Then you say, man, we really need to have a conversation about workforce development. That's where we got to focus. And then you say, you know what, in order for us to have a conversation about workforce development, we really need, we really need people that are getting an education. So we got to have a conversation about education. Right? So you end up playing this whack-a-mole game without seeing the holistic ways that and the interconnections between each of these areas. I will tell you, just just so you know, in 2013, they actually did bring back the local diploma. Part of the reason why graduation rates in Rochester have actually gone up pretty significantly over the course of the last 8 years is because of the reintroduction of the local diploma. As an aside, I also wonder the extent to which our education system is responsive to the changing economic conditions. Follow me for 2 seconds. Horace Mann, many of you may know who Horace Mann, the theoretician behind our current education system, was largely responding to this industrialization that was happening in the economy and said, geez, we need to be able to train a lot more people a lot more quickly. We need normal schools to train teachers. We have to get out of these one-room schoolhouses and into a more an educational form that's more attuned to the industrial conditions. Guess what, my friends? The industrial age is over. It's done. Yet we are still using those same kinds of models. So it's really important that we are attentive to those changes. One way, and I don't want to lose this point because it's really, really important. Many of you are walking into rooms, whether it's clinics or clinical settings, into operating rooms. And if you are people of color, you often are the diversity. And if you are white, you are often in a place where there is very little or no diversity in this community. Again, consider the friction that we need in order to create better outcomes. My ideal for Rochester is that more people start to get involved in some of these issues, not only as a moral imperative, right? It's terrible to see children suffer. That's wrong. There's something inherently bad about that. But you know what else? As a practical matter, as an economic matter, this community cannot grow with the practices that we have engaged in. When the references that Melanie made to not being seen, you know who wasn't seeing people? George Eastman, who in one breath was sending money to historically black colleges and universities, and in the same breath was barring people of color from working at Kodak. So we have to change those conditions. You have to walk into those rooms and say, this isn't right, but also this won't work.
That's it.
Our clinic won't work. Our operating room won't work. Our hospital won't work. Our university won't work if we are leaving this many people on the sidelines and if we aren't benefiting from the insights and the friction that that social difference creates.
Absolutely. Because if we don't, what we don't understand, we keep trying to say that this is altruistic. This is survival. You can't survive without me and I can't survive without you. Period. Without the diversity of thought, we will not grow. And I think people want to say, well, no, that's it. Plain, simple. Simeon said it. I love him because he always says it, right? And I like to offer examples. I use my own life because I don't have the right to speak from anybody else's. When my now 23-year-old daughter was a baby, I came to the doctor and I was again the diversity in the room. And there was there was a new doctor. I stripped my baby and my baby had Mongolian spots. Does anyone here know what Mongolian spots are? All right. All right. I think you're a medical. So what's a Mongolian spot? And where do you find them? I mean, who are they? Who do you see them a lot in? People of color, people, high melanated folks. But what you understand? It can look, it's a hyperpigmentation. Sometimes you'll see it in the lower butt area on some kids. It can look like a bruise. So I undressed my baby. I'm sitting up here with my baby, and all my babies had these Mongolian spots. And the doctor is looking at me in horror. And I'm looking at the doctor. The nurses are looking at him like he's crazy. He's looking at me. I'm looking at him. They're looking at me. We're looking at him. You know, something out of a sitcom. And it hits me. And I look at and I grab my baby and I said, read a book. Right? Because understand, my baby needs to be seen. But I'm afraid if I let go of my baby, they're going to call CPS because I can see what he's thinking. And in that moment, I am not a college educated, married Black woman, married her college sweetheart. I'm not that. I'm a ghetto welfare baby mom.
Who abuses her children.
Who abuses her kids. And so I'm standing there and the nurses see that this whole visit has turned. Now, let me tell you, this is not my doctor. I am here because a friend of mine convinced me that Black people participating in research is important so that we can diversify the pool, so we can know what works for us. So I'm bringing my baby to be part of this study to learn. So this is not like a regular visit. But now I'm thinking that someone's going to take my baby away for something that's naturally occurring. Now, the reason I'm bringing up this story is that what would the U of R be without R01s? What would y'all be without y'all research? It's not rhetorical. A college, right? And what would your endowment be? What would your money be without that research? A pittance. And what would your research be without people to take part? Crap. I'm just being very basic for y'all so no one not understands. So in order for this institution to remain viable, you need the diversity of thought. You can't survive without it. So please, what we want you to stop thinking of it as altruistic. I think of it as survivalistic, if that's a word, right? You need this for your own survival. And for me, what I need you all to do, medical students, I need you all to ask the question, what am I not learning? What are you not giving me to equip me every day? Who am I not learning about? Whose voice am I not hearing in my rotations? Because when you get out here, it's up to people like me to eat you alive. Ask Eric Kane. Because I got to make sure that you do no harm. So what I need you all to do is to start asking. Administrators, I need you to ask. What do I need to do? Who do I need to bring into the room? Who do I need to put my imprimatur on to make sure their voice is heard? People who are working in finance, how do I need to advise the C-suite folks to know how to move their money so that it is more equitable, so that we are making sure that all the boats rise? Those are things that we need to do.
Thank you, Melanie. We have a couple of minutes left. I want to give the opportunity to Dr. Rotondo for his remarks, and then Mr. Miller.
Well, I think you can see why Melanie Funchess is the leader that she is in the community, and you can see why Simeon Banister is on our board now. And because these voices are so important to give us to keep us really in touch with really what is happening, to keep us very clear about, you know, where those deficits are and how we need to continue to change and grow. I think that I'm proud to say that over the last couple of years, the movement that we've had here in equity and anti-racism, the movement that we've had in health equity in particular, which I haven't spoken too much directly about what we are doing from a structure, process, and outcomes perspective, we've made great progress, but it's not enough, and we recognize it. And it's going to be a long journey. The analogy that I use with mixed results, quite frankly, with mixed reaction, is that of building a cathedral here. We need to be able to be sure that we are moving those blocks of granite every single day, but it is going to take a long time for us to get to where we need to go. But we have to maintain our level of accountability and responsibility to move forward. And when I think about the 9-year disparity in life expectancy that exists 4 miles apart in this community, and in Chicago, thanks to Bob Holloway, a paper he shared with me, 16 years between, you know, the loop and a number of miles to the west. I don't know that I'll be around to see that disparity disappear. But I do know that while I'm here and while we are here, we have the ultimate responsibility to keep moving those blocks of granite and keep building that cathedral.
Thank you. Thank you.
Did you want to take the question, or do you want me to talk about the last?
I think if you can
You should the question.
Oh, okay.
give a comment. I think we're
Question.
getting
Sure.
to the end. Zoom
Which hour?
invites cut off for people.
All right, I mean, I'll just
You can
make a
answer
couple of
afterwards.
comments on the previous question that came up, because that whole issue of schools and what happens with schooling is probably the last real challenge that we have that seems immovable. The fact that we can go less than a mile and be from the worst school district in the state to the best school district in the state is a huge problem for us. The fact that we can't find ways to, in a place like this, I mean, this is a university. I mean, it would be heresy in here to say, don't go to college. I mean, everybody in here would say, wait, no, you can't say that. This is the U of R. But the reality is everybody should have the opportunity to go to college, but everybody doesn't have to go to college. There are a number of things that we would love to see people do. Everybody's heard of Isaac Heating. Well, I talked with Ray Isaac, and Ray Isaac said, I can't find people to work for me to do heating, ventilating, and air conditioning. I can't find people. I had to start my own school, Isaac University, they call it, to train people to do HVAC. And when I talk to people over at Local 13, the plumbers, they say, nobody's coming in to learn plumbing. We've got all these people who are in their 50s and 60s out here doing plumbing, and there's nobody behind them. So, we have plumbing, carpentry, electrical, HVAC. We have all these jobs that are going to be very shortly vacated by people with nobody to fill them. So we have to try and find ways to get people to go to college, but we also find ways to get people to go do something else because we still need those people. And guess what? Those jobs, those jobs where you're working with your hands, they're not as glamorous, but they pay pretty well. And they have three things that are very important. They're portable. If you learn to be a plumber, you can be a plumber here. If you decide you want to go to Florida, you can be a plumber in Florida. They're entrepreneurial. If you decide I'm a plumber, now I want to start my own plumbing business, you can do that. And you know what? Your plumbing can't be outsourced to China. If your plumbing needs to be fixed, it needs to be fixed right here in Rochester. Somebody right here in Rochester has to do it, and we can't send it out and have it done. So for those three reasons, I always try to encourage people to look at college as an opportunity. But if it doesn't make sense to you, if you don't feel like this is exactly what you should be doing, you should look at something else. And the other thing I want to say, just to bring this back to healthcare for a minute, is that healthcare is very important, but Melanie kind of touched on this, and it really is important that we see people for who they are, but we also see ourselves in the people. And for many years in Rochester, we had a fairly large size population of people of color in this city. As I mentioned, back in the 1950s, more than 25,000. And for many of those years, there were 4 doctors of color in the city of Rochester: Dr. Lunsford, Dr. Jordan, Dr. Body, and Dr. Pitts, Dr. Juanita Pitts, the first African-American woman doctor in the city of Rochester in 1954. And that was it. Those were the 4 doctors that could see all of those 25 to 30,000 Black people. Think about that. I mean, if you divide them up equally, that's 6,000 patients per doctor. I mean, that's a lot. And, Dr. Lunsford was our doctor. And you know what? You could never go to Dr. Lunsford's office and not have 25 people sitting there waiting to be seen by him, by one doctor. And on top of that, he used to make house calls. When we were sick as little kids, my mom would call him and he would show up at the house and he had this big bag and he would look at you and he would say, okay, you need this. And he would give you a couple of pills and then he would be gone. I mean, we can't continue in a situation like that where there is so much for some and so little for others. So I just leave you with that as people in this profession of helping and healing people, just make sure that you understand that your role is helping and healing everybody, not just people who look like you.
But in the Dr. Lunsford example, I want us to not lose the thing about Dr. Pitts and Dr. Body and Dr. Lunsford and Dr. Jordan is that they saw us.
Yes, exactly.
They knew that if they come, if Dr. Jordan comes to your house and you need X, Y, and Z, and you know that you don't have a financial way to get it, listen, go see so-and-so and get a such and such. Boil it down, do this, or what, that we found ways to make it because they saw us in the entirety of who we were.
Yeah.
So as we grow
They
and
used to take,
everybody.
they used to take pies. as
Yes.
payment, or bread, or, I mean,
But my thing is that it's, even if it's not just the financial, it's like, if I should be able to go into a doctor who sees me into the totality of who I am. And if they present me with a prescription that's $500 and I don't have $500, it says, well, try to see if we can get this. But if we can't get this, we'll do this.
right.
Or, just to be able to see me and see why, to see the fullness of me.
Right.
We should not have to give up what we had to get what we need.
Thank you for that, Melanie. One last word, Banister.
Oh, okay. So the one little parting gift I'd like to leave you with is that we still live in an economic regime where money matters. And because we live in an economic regime where money matters, many of the people that are in this room are either today or soon will be very high earners. And because you will be very high earners, and because you will have those resources, that is equivalent to an outsized level of power and therefore responsibility, I would argue, in this community. So as you think about if you choose to invest your money with political officials and elected folks, I ask that you keep your equity and justice lens when that happens. If you decide that you're going to go and buy and purchase, because we know that advertisers respond to consumer habits, I ask you to keep your equity and justice lens on at that moment, because if we are able to shift what the expectations are,
Yes.
then we can shift what the outcomes are. I want to leave you one last quote from Gwendolyn Brooks. And it's one that really impacted me. She says, she was a great poet in the 20th century. She says, "We are each other's harvest. We are each other's business. We are each other's magnitude and bond."
With that, we'd wrap this panel discussion. As you can see, we could go on for hours with these four. They're brilliant and they know their subject, and we're so thankful for having them here today.
Somebody literally like, I think